The first thing Velthorn said to me was not a greeting, it was a question, and it was not directed at me, it was directed at the rest of the class, all 43 of them sitting in their assigned tiers, their various sets of eyes and compound lenses and heat-sensitive sensory pits angled toward the front of the room. He stood at the projection panel with his long blue-gray fingers raised above it, not touching it yet, letting the silence do the work of building anticipation. He was good at that. He had been doing it for 31 years. "Can anyone tell me," he said, "why the species seated in the back row consistently scores in the lowest percentile of every entrance evaluation this academy has administered in the last 60 cycles?" 43 students turned to look at me. I was the only one in the back row. I was the only human in the room. I looked back at them without blinking. I had learned a long time ago not to flinch at things that were just words. On Earth we had a saying, words were the cheapest weapon in the world because the person using them could always claim they never meant them. Velthorn answered his own question. Before anyone else could, he always answered his own questions. That was part of the style. Because Deathworlders, he said, pronouncing the word the way someone would say something unpleasant they had found on the bottom of their boot, are products of chaos. Their cognition is reactive, not reflective. Their emotional architecture floods their decision-making centers under pressure. They survive their home world not through intelligence but through a particularly fortunate combination of biological stubbornness and statistical luck compounded over several million years. A few students laughed, some just looked relieved that they were not the ones being described. A silver-skinned student in the second row, a Devathi, had learned from a world with gravity about half of Earth's, which would explain the easy confidence that comes from never having had to work very hard to hold yourself upright. Was writing something in his notes. I could not see what. I suspected it was not a counter-argument. I picked up my stylus and wrote the date at the top of my page. Then I wrote down exactly what Velthorn had said, word for word. I did not know yet what I was going to do with it. I only knew that on Earth we had a second saying about things that people did out in the open where everyone could see. We called that evidence. My name is Mara Elliott. I was 17 years old when I arrived at the Interstellar Academy of Unified Sciences, which the galaxy called the IAUS, and which my mother had called, standing in the departure terminal back in Wellington with her arms folded and her chin tilted up in the way she did when she was proud and worried at the same time. The furthest away you have ever gone and the most you have ever deserved. I had earned my placement through 3 years of competitive examinations, 2 academic endorsements from researchers at the New Geneva Exobiology Institute, and a 40-page research submission on human immune adaptation in high-pathogen environments. The Academy's admissions committee had described it in their acceptance letter as uncommonly specific for an applicant of this age. I had beaten 962 other applicants from 41 species across 6 star systems. Velthorn did not know any of that when he stood at his projection panel on the first day of the first week and used me as a negative example, or perhaps he knew and had decided it did not matter. That I would come to learn was more likely. Vel then was not ignorant. He was certain, which is a different condition. Entirely, and in some ways considerably more dangerous. The Academy was built on a space station called Orenda, which orbited a pale orange gas giant in a system so far from Earth that the light from our sun would take 11 years to reach it. Everything about the station was built for species with different needs than mine. The corridors were lit in the violet spectrum because most attending species processed that range comfortably and found full spectrum light disorienting. The gravity was set at 0.8 Earth standard, which meant I walked around feeling slightly unmoored, as if the ground was offering me less than I was used to, and my body could not decide whether to be relieved or suspicious. The air carried a faint chemical undertone that the orientation documents assured me was completely harmless to humans. I had decided to believe them, mostly because I did not have the equipment to test it, and worrying about it would have been a poor use of attention. My dormitory roommate was a Velhari named Kieran. The Velhari were an insected species from a temperate low-gravity world whose primary continent was covered in layered canopy forest so dense that the sky was only visible from the uppermost branches. They had 4 arms, compound eyes, capable of processing 14 distinct wavelengths of light, and a complete and principled inability to understand why anyone would eat something that had previously been alive. Kieran had stood against the far wall of our shared room for the first 20 minutes after I arrived, watching me unpack with all 4 arms held still, her antennae pressed flat against her narrow head. I had already learned from the orientation materials that flat antennae meant something between caution and deep concern. "You are the Death World human," she said. "Mara," I said. "I read that humans require 8 hours of complete unconsciousness every single cycle, or they begin to deteriorate cognitively," she said. "Give or take," I said. "That is a significant vulnerability." She said there was no judgment in her voice, only observation. She was cataloging, not mocking. There was a difference, and it mattered. "Yes," I said. "It is." I put my boots in the bottom of the closet, straightened up, and looked at her. "Everything has one." She was quiet for a long moment, her antennae shifting slightly from their flat position toward something more upright. Then she said, "I will try not to make loud sounds during those 8 hours. That was how we became something like friends." The Academy organized its students into 5 academic tiers. Tier 1 occupied the front rows of every classroom, nearest the instructor, and the seats with the best projection angles and clearest sound transmission. Tier 5 sat at the back. The assignment was based on the Unified Species Cognitive Index, a ranking system the Academy had applied for 40 years to determine as its founding document stated optimal learning environment placement in accordance with documented interspecies cognitive variation. I had read the founding documents on the transit over. I had also read the papers that underpinned the cognitive index. Almost all of them had been authored by Orathi researchers. The Orathi were the dominant species in this part of the galaxy, the most numerous, the most economically powerful, and the architects of the interstellar consortium that had built and funded the Academy. Velthun was Orathi. The majority of the senior faculty were Orathi. The Council of 7, which governed the Academy's academic and administrative decisions had 5 Orathi members and 2 from allied species. Humans were Tier 5. Every human who had ever attended the Academy in the 80 years since first contact was established had been placed in Tier 5. Not one of us in 80 years had been placed anywhere else. The second session of Velthon's course was worse in a quieter way than the first. On the first day he had at least been looking at me when he said the things he said. On the second day he did not look at me at all. I had become a reference point rather than a person, a data example he gestured toward without making eye contact, the way a cartographer might indicate a feature on a map without feeling anything about the feature itself. Today's module was on adaptive response. Hierarchies across species. He ranked 12 species by what he called stress, architecture, sophistication. Humans were 11th. The only species ranked below us was 1. He described as having no known cortical development above the brainstem. Equivalent, he said this without irony. I wrote it all down. I wrote down what he said and what he cited and what the date was and what the room number was. I wrote down who laughed and who did not. I was building something and I did not yet know its final shape, but I knew that the materials needed to be documented precisely from the beginning. Because in any process that relies on evidence, the early records are always the ones people try to dispute first. After class, I went to the academy library, a large quiet space in the station's inner ring where the violet light was softer and the access terminals gave you unfiltered reach into the full galactic academic archive. I had a reading list I had been adding to since the night of the first session. I sat down at a terminal and worked through it for 3 hours. By the end, I had confirmed 6 of the flags I had placed on Velthon's papers, and I had found 2 more I had not been looking for but which had made themselves obvious through the particular logic of a researcher who always needs his conclusion to go in the same direction regardless of what the data says. I left the library at the end of the evening period and walked back through the station's outer corridors where the viewport panels were larger and the gas giant filled the view on the right hand side. I stopped at one of the panels and looked at it for a while. It was enormous in the way that things outside a human scale are enormous, not threatening, just incomprehensibly large, existing by rules of physics that operated at a different register than anything on Earth. I thought about the fact that it had been doing this, orbiting, rotating, moving through its vast pattern for longer than our species had existed, before Earth had produced anything that could look at it, before the IAUS had been built, before Velthon had written a single paper. It would still be doing this after all of us were gone. That was in its own way clarifying. I sat in the back row on that first day and watched Velthon present his neurocognitive mapping charts. He had colored them carefully. The Orathi mapping was rendered in rich blue, labeled with words like robust and adaptive. The human mapping was flat gray. The label next to it read limited upper processing bandwidth. He delivered the words with the same tone a geologist might use to describe the composition of ordinary rock. It was not contempt exactly, it was something quieter than contempt, the complete absence of the thought that I might disagree. I wrote down the name of every study he cited. I wrote the slide numbers. I wrote the specific claims and the page numbers he quoted. After class, Kieran fell into step beside me in the violet corridor. Her antennae were raised at the base but bent at the tip, a position I was beginning to learn meant something. Between anxiety and the desire to say something she was not certain was, "Welcome. You were very quiet in there," she said. "I was listening," I said. "He says things like that most sessions," she said, "about the lower-tier species. Last cycle he delivered an entire lecture on why Yerathi emotional processing produces a permanent ceiling on research innovation. One of the Yerathi students walked out. She paused. They were given a formal disciplinary notation on their attendance record. "What happened to Velden?" I said. "Nothing happened to Velden," she said. "He has tenure. He has 31 years of published research. He has 2 former students on the council." I let that information settle into place, each piece finding its position in a picture that was beginning to show its shape. "Kieran," I said as we reached the corridor junction that branched toward the dormitory wing, "is there any formal process for challenging what an instructor presents academically through official channels?" Her antennae pressed flat immediately. "There is a protocol," she said after a moment, "the formal academic dispute. Any enrolled student may invoke it against any member of the faculty. The case is heard before the Council of 7. She stopped walking and turned to face me. "No student has invoked it against a tenured senior instructor in 30 cycles. The last student who filed a complaint against a faculty member of any rank had their enrollment placed under performance review. What happened to the instructor in that case?" I said. "Nothing," she said. "I see," I said. "You should not think about it," she said. "I'm not thinking about it," I said. That was technically true. I was not thinking about it yet. I was still in the first phase, which is gathering. On Earth, when you are dealing with something large and unfamiliar, the worst thing you can do is move before you understand it fully. You need to know the shape of a thing before you decide how to face it. That night I pulled up the academic research archive on my reader and searched for every paper Velthon had published on death world species in his 31 years at the Academy. There were 14 of them. I downloaded all 14 and began reading. Order of publication date. By the 3rd paper, I had my first note flagged in red. By the 7th, I had 6 flagged. I did not sleep the full 8 hours. I slept 6 and spent the other 2 reading. Kieran did not make any sounds during those hours. She sat on her side of the room under a soft violet lamp and worked on a translation problem. At some point, well after midnight, she looked up at me. "You said you were not thinking about it," she said. "I changed my mind," I said. She looked at me for a moment, then she said something I would return to many times in the weeks that followed. "On my world, there is a word for what you are doing right now. It does not translate well. The closest I have found in any other language is something like the act of deciding that a thing which has been wrong for a long time has been wrong long enough." I looked at the screen. 14 papers, 11 errors found so far, and I was only halfway through. "That is a good word," I said. "You should still be careful," she said. "I know," I said. She turned back to her translation. I turned back to the archive. Outside the small circular viewport above my desk, the gas giant filled the lower half of the view, enormous and patient and completely indifferent to everything happening on the station above it, the way enormous things tend to be. I looked at it for a moment, then I looked back at my screen and kept reading. The stress response demonstration happened on a Tuesday, which was the Academy's equivalent of a midweek mandatory session. Vel then announced it at the start of class with a casual authority that comes from decades of never being questioned about anything. Today, he said, adjusting the projection to display a sequence of physiological monitoring charts, we will observe cross-species stress response variation in real time. This is a documented methodology used in comparative xenobiology research. All participating students signed consent documentation during enrollment orientation. He looked at me. I had signed the enrollment orientation packet. It was 412 pages long. The translator assigned to new human students had flagged it as standard administrative documentation. I had signed it because every other student had signed it, and because at the time I had been more focused on finding my dormitory before the first meal period ended. I filed that away. Another note, another red flag. The device Velthon produced looked like a small silver cylinder. He explained it to the class the way you explain things when you want to impress people with the sophistication of your equipment, carefully, with pauses for appreciation. It projected a neurological stimulus, pattern calibrated to trigger a startle response in species with a standard galactic fear architecture. He had used it in this class for 12 cycles, he said. The results were always predictable. He asked me to come to the front. I walked up. 43 students watched. I stood in front of the cylinder and looked at Velthon. He activated it. I know what happened physiologically. I have read enough about it since. My heart rate jumped 18%. My pupils dilated. There was a brief spike in cortisol. All the normal things that are supposed to happen when something produces a threat stimulus happened inside my body, where no one could see them. What did not happen was anything visible on the outside. I stood there. I did not move. I did not blink faster than usual. My hands were at my sides and they stayed there. The class was very quiet. Velthon ran it a second time at a higher intensity. I thought about a thunderstorm I had sat through in the Appalachian Mountains when I was 9 years old, alone in a tent, while my father hiked back from the ranger station. Lightning was striking the ridge every 30 seconds. I had lain in my sleeping bag and counted the seconds between flash and sound, tracking the storm's distance the way he had taught me. I had been afraid, but I had also been counting, and counting is a very useful thing to do when you are afraid. The second pulse ended. I was still standing there. Velthon turned to the class. What you are observing, he said, is not bravery or cognitive control. It is an absence of normal threat processing. The human fear architecture is so dysregulated by chronic death world exposure that standard threat stimuli simply do not register as meaningful. It is, in a clinical sense, a form of damage. I walked back to my seat. I did not say anything. I was not ready yet, but I wrote down the word he had used. Damage. I thought about what Earth had asked of every living thing that had Ever tried to survive on it? I thought. About bacteria developing resistance. I thought about immune systems learning to recognize 10,000 pathogens. I thought about evolution, which is the slowest and most patient argument in the universe, and which never loses because it has no deadline and no ego. Damage, I wrote, then I wrote below it. Or adaptation, which one depends entirely on who is doing the measuring. Kiernan was waiting for me in the corridor after class. Her antennae were in a position I had not seen before. A rapid, tight oscillation, she later told me, was the Velhari equivalent of barely contained fury on someone else's behalf. That was wrong, she said. Yes, I said. He called it damage, she said. He did, I said. You should have said something, she said. Not yet, I said. Kiernan, how much time do we have before the next academic review cycle? She looked at me, understanding the shift in the conversation. I had stopped asking casual questions. I was asking logistical ones. 6 weeks, she said slowly. Good, I said. I need 5. The second practical lab assignment also happened that week. The task was to analyze a biological data set from a newly cataloged death world organism, predatory species from a high-pressure oceanic world in the outer reaches of the fourth galactic arm, and identify primary adaptation markers. Velthon assigned us to groups, every student in my group was Tier 4 or Tier 5. He had sorted the low-tier students together and called it, without any self-consciousness whatsoever, balanced grouping for equitable participation. Outcomes. I wrote that phrase down too. In the lab, the Devathi student from the second row, the silver-skinned one whose name I had since learned was Preth, examined the data set with the air of someone conducting a charitable exercise. He turned to me with the particular expression that people wear when they have decided to be generous to someone they do not expect much from. I assume you are familiar with death world biology, he said, given the obvious. Show me the data set, I said. He looked at me for a moment, then he turned the screen toward me. I found 3 adaptation markers in the first 40 minutes that the rest of the group had not identified. Preth entered them into the report without acknowledging who had found them. That was fine. I was not collecting credit from him. I was collecting data about what happened in this room when a human contributed something that mattered. What happened was nothing. No one looked surprised. They had simply not expected anything useful from me, and when it came, there was no framework for it, so it was processed without comment and filed as unremarkable. That was useful to know. After the lab, walking beside Kieran, the corridor, I felt something shift inside me. Not anger. I had moved past the phase where anger was the primary thing. Something sharper and calmer than anger. The kind of clarity that arrives when you have been watching something long enough to finally see the whole shape of it. The next 5 weeks were the most productive of my life. I worked in the early mornings before the main academy systems powered up, when the archive was fastest and the study rooms were empty. I pulled every paper Velthan had published in the last 30 years and built a single document organized not by paper but by claim. Every empirical claim he had made in his published curriculum and his research record mapped against the evidence he had cited, verified against whether that evidence actually said what he claimed it said. It frequently did not. Some errors were the kind that could charitably be described as aggressive interpretation, places where a data set showing ambiguous results had been described as showing clear confirmation. Some were harder to explain charitably. There was one paper on human reaction time under cognitive load that had used a testing protocol specifically designed for species with a 3-hemisphere neural architecture. Humans have a 2-hemisphere architecture. The protocol's own technical documentation included a note flagging it as unsuitable for 2 hemispheres species. That note had been available for 18 years. Velthan's paper had not mentioned it. His curriculum had never been updated to address it. What I found the more I read was a kind of architecture, not the architecture of deliberate deception. I want to be precise about this because precision matters, and accusing someone of intentional fraud when what you can actually prove is institutional negligence would have weakened the filing. What I found was the architecture of a researcher who had decided on his conclusions early and had then spent 30 years building an academic record around them, selecting sources that supported them, declining to update his curriculum when contradicting evidence appeared, and writing with a confidence that his citation counts had steadily reinforced. It is possible to be this wrong without being dishonest in any simple way. You can convince yourself if your early work receives enough validation that your conclusions are settled. You can stop checking not because you are hiding something but because you genuinely believe there is nothing left to find. The problem with this is that the world keeps producing evidence regardless of whether you are looking at it, and a researcher who has stopped checking becomes slowly and without intending to someone whose work is no longer describing reality but describing the version of reality they committed to 30 years ago. That was what I was finding in Velthan's papers, not lies, something more frustrating, certainty that had outlived its evidence. The more I understood the structure of it, the more clearly I could see how to address it. The response to certainty built on outdated foundations is not an emotional challenge. It is not an argument about attitude or intent. It is documentation. You show the foundation, you show what it was built on, you show what has changed since it was laid and why the structure above it can no longer bear the weight that has been placed on it. That is what the 7 counts were. That was what I was building. And then there was the 7th error, the one that mattered most. The paper was titled Cognitive Ceiling: Assessment in Death World Origin Species, a Neurophysiological Study. Velthan had published it 30 years ago. It had become the foundational reference for the treatment of human students across the galactic academic consortium. It had been cited 240 times. It was the primary basis for the Unified Species Cognitive Index ranking that placed humans in Tier 5. It was the reason I was sitting in the back row under the Academy's open records policy. Any research conducted on station more than 20 years ago had its data request, ethics submission, and internal correspondence made publicly available in the archive. I read the ethics submission first, then the raw data request, then I found the internal correspondence file, which contained 12 messages exchanged between Velthan and his research team during the course of the study. The study's human test subject sample was 11 people. I read that number 3 times, not because I did not understand it, because I wanted to be certain I was not misreading something. 11 human beings whose neurophysiological assessments had become the basis for a conclusion cited 240 times and used to shape the academic placement of every human student in the galaxy for 30 years. Then I found the message from Seal Ron. Seal Ron was listed in the papers. Acknowledgements as a junior research associate. The message was sent from Seal Ron's research station, account 2. Day of the study. It was brief. It stated that several of the human subjects were showing elevated stress markers and reduced oxygen saturation levels consistent with hypoxic response, and asked whether the testing schedule should be postponed until their conditions stabilized. Velthon's reply was 2 sentences. He said the timeline could not be adjusted. He said the data would be sufficient. I sat with that for a long time. I thought about Seal Ron, who had been a junior researcher 30 years ago and had asked the right question and received 2 sentences back and then stayed quiet for 3 decades while the paper was published and cited and used. I thought about 11 human beings sitting in a testing room with their blood oxygen dropping below the normal human threshold, being asked to solve problems and respond to stimuli while instruments measured their performance. I thought about what Velthon's paper eventually concluded, that this was what human cognitive capacity looked like at its normal best. The thing about finding Seal Ron's message was that it did not feel like a discovery in the dramatic sense. There was no sudden clarity, no shock of realization. It arrived the way most true things arrive, when you have been looking carefully, quietly, with the quality of something that was always there waiting to be found. I read the message. I read Velthon's reply. I read both of them again. Then I sat back in my chair and looked at its study room wall for a moment. Seal Ron had been a junior researcher. They had noticed something wrong with the conditions and had asked a reasonable question. The answer they received was 2 sentences that prioritized schedule over accuracy. What Seal Ron did after that, whether they stayed on the research team, whether they continued in academic work, whether they thought about those 2 sentences in the years that followed, I did not know and would probably never know. The archive only went so far. But the message had been there, filed with the correspondence record for 30 years, waiting in the open records archive for someone who thought to look at the ethics submission and follow the thread back to the team communications. Not hidden, not destroyed, just there. Unretrieved because nobody had looked. I saved the correspondence to 3 separate backup locations. Then I kept working. Kieran came into the study room one morning at 6:30 carrying nutrient drinks for herself and coffee for me, which she had taken to keeping in the common room dispenser. She set the coffee on the table and looked at my screen. Her antennae rose very slowly. "How many?" she said. 7 confirmed. I said 2 more. I want to verify before I include them. I will not file anything I cannot prove. 3 different ways. She sat down. "You are going to file the dispute?" "Yes," I said. Myra, she wrapped 2 of her forearms around her container and was quiet for a moment. "If the council sides with him, which they have done before with smaller complaints, they can recommend an academic performance review. If that Review goes badly, they can recommend a placement reassessment. Your enrollment could be terminated. I know, I said. You could lose everything you came here for, she said. I looked at my screen, 7 confirmed. Errors 240 citations, 11 oxygen. Compromised human subjects whose results have been used to tell every species in the galaxy that humans had a cognitive ceiling. Kiernan, I said. I did not come here to keep my head down and let someone tell lies about my species in a classroom while I sat in the back row and wrote polite notes. She was quiet for a moment, then one of her arms reached across the table and tapped mine once, a Vilhari gesture of solidarity that she had explained to me in the second week, a small thing but real. Then we had better make the filing. Perfect, she said. It will be, I said. I filed the formal academic dispute on a Wednesday morning, exactly 5 weeks and 2 days after Velthan had stood me in front of that cylinder and called Earth's work on my species a form of damage. The Academy's administrative system flagged it immediately as anomalous. I received 3 automated messages in rapid succession. The third said a liaison would contact me within 48 hours. In the meantime, the filing was under procedural review. Pratt found me in the cafeteria the following morning. He sat down across from me without being invited, in the easy way of someone who has never seriously considered that space might not be available to him. I heard you filed against Velthan, he said. It is a public filing, I said. Anyone can view it. There's a betting pool among the Devathi students, he said. The majority position is that you will be censured and removed from the program within 3 weeks of the hearing. I put my credits on 6 weeks. I thought you might hold on a bit longer just on stubbornness. Thank you for the confidence, I said. Something in his expression shifted slightly. You found 3 adaptation markers in that lab session faster than anyone in any group I have worked with in 2 cycles here, he said. He said it quietly, as though he was reporting something he had not decided yet whether it reflected well on him or poorly on the circumstances. Just so you know. He left. I finished my coffee and went back to verifying count 6 for the 4th time. The administrative liaison was a pale gray Orathi named Finn, who spent our meeting going through the procedural requirements 3 times very slowly, in a way I understood was intended to find a reason to return the filing. Without processing it, I had anticipated this. I answered every question precisely, cited the relevant charter sections from memory, and provided every required document in the format specified by the charter appendix, including 3 that were technically optional but which I had included to leave no gap. By the end of the meeting, Finn was entering my submission into the formal processing queue with the expression of someone who had been hoping to find a closed door and instead found a corridor that led somewhere they had not planned to go. The hearing was confirmed 2 days later. Grand Chamber of the Council of 7. 14 days out. Veltha's statement appeared on the academic announcements board the same afternoon. 3 sentences. He welcomed the opportunity to demonstrate the correct application of dispute protocol. The hearing would serve as an educational example of rigorous scientific thinking. He looked forward to addressing what he called an earnest but uninformed challenge. I read it once, then I went back to Work. There were 7 counts, 14 days. I was going to know each one so completely that nothing in that chamber could put any distance between me and the truth of it. The night before the hearing, I did not sleep. Not all night. I slept 4 hours, which was enough to function clearly, and considerably more than 0, which was where anxiety would have left me if I had let it direct the evening. I got up at 4:00 in the morning and made coffee from the supply I kept in my desk drawer because the common room dispenser was not available until 6:00, and I had learned in the second week not to depend on things that were not consistently available. I read the correspondence from C. Huron one more time, not because I needed to, because I wanted that to be the most recent thing I had read when I walked into the chamber. I wanted to carry it with me, not the anger of it, but the clarity of it, the simple, plain, documented fact of what had happened and what it had been used to build. Then I ran through my notes for all 7 counts in sequence. I timed myself, presenting each one at the pace I intended to use, in the chamber measured, with pauses for counsel acknowledgement. Count 1 took 3 minutes and 40 seconds. Count 7 took 7 minutes and 15 seconds. Total time for all 7 was approximately 38 minutes. I was ready. C. Huron appeared in the study room doorway at 6:00 in the morning. She had brought coffee, which she now kept stocked for me as a matter of quiet routine that neither of us had ever formally discussed. She set it on the table and looked at me. "You did not sleep," she said. 4 hours, I said. "Enough." "Are you ready?" she said. I thought about it honestly. The grand chamber held 300 observers, and I had walked past it twice, but never been inside. The Council of 7 had governed this academy for longer than I had been alive. Velthan had 31 years of published research and 2 former students on the council, and a statement on the announcement board calling my challenge uninformed. I thought about Seal Ron, who had sent one message asking the right question, received 2 sentences telling them to carry on, and then stayed quiet for 30 years. "Yes," I said. Kiernan's antennae rose to the position that had no translation she had ever been able to give me. "Then let us go," she said. The grand chamber of the Interstellar Academy of Unified Sciences occupied a full sector of the station's outer ring. Its curved viewport looked out on the gas giant below, and the orange light coming through it lay in long diagonal shapes across the chamber floor. The seats rose in concentric rings from the central floor, and when I walked in through the lower entry, every seat was occupied. I had not expected so many people. 287 observers, I learned later from the session log Kiernan pulled for me. Students, faculty, administrative staff, and 3 independent academic monitors who had traveled from off-station specifically for this hearing. A first-cycle student filing a 7-count dispute against a senior instructor of Velthan standing was not the kind of event that happened often enough to miss. Velthan was already at the respondents' table, seated between 3 senior faculty colleagues, all Arathi, all wearing the composed expressions of people who expect to be waiting a short time before the anticipated outcome arrives. He looked at me when I came in. He did not look concerned. He looked the way you look when you are watching a process whose conclusion you already know. I sat at the petitioner's table. I Arranged my documents in the order I had planned. I set my stylus to the right. I folded my hands and looked at the council. Council head Vashquil was a long-bodied Arathi whose silver scales shifted through gradients of color in the orange light. She called the session to order. Read the formal statement of purpose, established the procedural parameters, and confirmed that the session was open to Academy observers as required by charter. Then she looked at me. The petitioner may open, she said. I stood up. I did not look at the gallery. I did not look at Velthan. I looked at the council members one by one briefly to establish that I was addressing them directly. Then I looked at my first document. Council head Vashquil, members of the council, faculty representatives, and fellow students, I said. I am Mara Elliott, first cycle student. Human Earth, I have filed this dispute on 7 counts of empirical inaccuracy in the published curriculum and research record of Senior Instructor Velthan. I will address each count in sequence, with full citation and primary source documentation. I will not speculate. I will not editorialize. I will present the evidence and allow it to speak for itself. I paused for one breath. Count 1, I said. Velthan's colleagues exchanged a glance. Velthan himself settled back in his chair and crossed his long fingers. He still had the look of a man watching a demonstration he had already seen the end of. That was about to become a problem for him. Count 1 was a claim in Velthan's second-year curriculum module stating that human long-term memory consolidation was structurally inferior to the galactic baseline. I presented the original study he had cited. Then I presented 3 papers published in the Unified Biological Sciences journal that had directly challenged and substantially revised that finding. All 3 had been available in the Academy archive for 18 years. Velthan's curriculum had not been updated to reflect them in any of those 18 years. The amber-colored council member, whose species I had still not fully identified, leaned forward slightly. I noted it and kept my pace. Count 2 was a methodological error, a paper on human reaction time under cognitive load. The testing protocol Velthan had used was designed for 3-hemisphere neural architectures. Humans have a 2-hemisphere architecture. The protocol's own technical documentation included a specific note flagging it as unsuitable for 2-hemisphere species. That note had existed since the paper's publication. A correction request had been filed with the journal 4 years after publication. Velthan had declined to attach that correction to the paper's record in the citation system. The amber-colored council member was now writing something. Count 3 concerned in Velthan's foundational course reader that attributed a specific statistical figure on human stress response to a paper from the Institute of Galactic Comparative Biology. I presented the paper. The figure did not appear in it. The paper said something meaningfully different from what Velthan had cited it as saying. I presented both texts side by side on the submission display. Count 4, Count 5, Count 6, each one followed the same structure: the claim, the cited source, the problem with the source, and the documented record of how long that problem had existed and remained unaddressed. My voice was level throughout. I did not move except to turn a page. The chamber was very quiet. Velthorn spoke twice during the first 6 counts. Both times he addressed Vash Keel rather than me. The first time he said the discrepancies fell within acceptable scholarly interpretive variance. The second time he said I was mischaracterizing the broader research consensus. Both times I waited until he had finished, then I cited the specific passage that addressed his objection directly. Both times after I finished, there was a silence with a particular quality, not empty but full, the way a silence is full when many people are processing the same thing at the same moment. Between count 3 and count 4, one of the council members, an older being from a species I had not encountered before my time at the academy, with long, pale limbs and eyes that reflected light differently depending on the angle, leaned slightly toward Vash Keel and said something I could not hear at the distance of the petitioner's table. Vash Keel did not respond visibly, but the amber-colored council member, who had been writing since count 1, looked up from the page and looked at me directly for a moment in a way that was not hostile or even particularly evaluative. It was more like someone recalibrating measurement they had taken before. I kept going. Count 4 was the one I had almost not included. It was the most technically complex, involving a cross-referencing dispute between 2 separate papers by 2 separate research groups, both of which Velthon had cited in his curriculum without noting that they contradicted each other in a fundamental way. Understanding why they contradicted each other required knowing something about the different experimental conditions each had used, which was information buried in the methodology sections rather than in the abstracts, the sections that most people citing a paper do not read. I had read them. I presented the contradiction and explained it in the simplest terms I could find, and I watched the amber council member's pen start moving again. Halfway through, count 5 was simpler. A data set cited as showing one thing which actually showed something quite different. When you read past the summary table, I presented both. I did not editorialize about what the difference meant. I let the difference speak, which it did, clearly without any help from me. Count 6 I had been most uncertain about including, not because the evidence was weak, the evidence was solid, but because it was the oldest of the 7 errors from a paper published 26 years ago, and I had wondered whether the council might feel that a 26-year-old error was too distant to be relevant. Then I had decided that age was not an argument in favor of an error, only in favor of how long it had been allowed to persist, and I kept it in the filing. Then I came to count 7. I paused before beginning it, not for any theatrical reason, because I wanted to be completely settled before I spoke. I had checked this section more than any other. I had verified the documentation more times than I had verified any other piece of evidence in the entire filing. I wanted there to be no tremor in my voice, no break in the sequence, no moment that could be interpreted as uncertainty. I was not uncertain, but I wanted the chamber to know that I had been in exactly 4 hearings worth of experience now, counting. Practice runs alone in the study room, and I knew that what mattered most in the moment before you began was not confidence, it was clarity. I had clarity in the 40-second cycle of the Academy's academic record. I said, Senior Instructor Velthon published a paper titled Cognitive Ceiling Assessment in Death World Origin Species, Neurophysiological Study. This paper has been cited 240 times in the galactic academic record. It has been used to inform the Unified Species Cognitive Index framework that governs academic tier placement at this academy and that 14 affiliated institutions. It is, by citation count and policy influence, the most consequential paper in the literature on death world origin species produced in the last 30 years. I opened the final document folder. The paper's conclusions state that humans demonstrate a measurable cognitive ceiling, placing them below the galactic median in 7 out of 10 key assessment categories. These conclusions are described as derived from a study conducted under standardized assessment conditions. I looked up from the page under the Academy's Open Records Policy, the Raw Data Request, Ethics Submission, and Internal Research Correspondence for any study conducted on station more than 20 years ago are publicly accessible. The archive, I accessed these records. The total human subject sample is documented in the original data request. I paused. It was 11 individuals. The chamber was absolutely still. 11 people, I said, the conclusions that have been cited 240 times, that have shaped placement policy across 15 academic institutions, that have been used in this classroom to characterize human cognitive capacity. Those conclusions were derived from 11 people. I let that stand in the air for a moment. The ethics submission associated with the study describes the testing conditions using the following language, and I am reading directly: conducted under field proximate conditions with subjects exhibiting moderate hypoxic stress response markers, hypoxic stress response markers. The subjects were not receiving adequate oxygen during the test. Their blood oxygen saturation levels were below the normal human threshold. I placed the printed ethics submission on the table where the council could see it. The internal research correspondence file contains 12 messages. Among them is a message sent by Junior Research Associate Sealron to Instructor Velthin on the 3rd day of the study. It states that the human subjects were showing elevated stress markers and reduced oxygen saturation consistent with hypoxic response, and asks whether testing should be postponed until conditions stabilized. I placed the printed correspondence beside the ethics submission. Instructor Velthorn's reply is 2 sentences. He states the timeline cannot be adjusted. He states the data will be sufficient. I looked at the council directly. The junior researcher asked the right question. The answer was no. The study continued. 11 human beings with blood oxygen below the normal human threshold were assessed for cognitive performance. Those assessments were published as representative of human cognitive capacity under standard conditions. The paper built on those assessments has been cited 240 times, and I am sitting in the back row of this academy's classrooms because of it. The silence that followed was the kind that fills a room from the floor all the way to the ceiling. Velthorn sat forward. His expression had changed. For the first time since I walked into that chamber, he no longer looked like a man watching a demonstration whose end he already knew. What the petitioner is describing, he said, and his voice was controlled but had something tight in it now, is a misrepresentation of standard adaptive Research methodology. Variable subject conditions are present in all field-adjacent studies. The conclusions reflect the full body of evidence gathered, not a single notation from a junior team member. The study had one testing period. I said 11 subjects all tested during that period. The ethics submission describes the conditions across the full duration of the study, not a single incident. The hypoxic markers were documented throughout. The petitioner is exhibiting precisely the kind of selective reasoning we have documented in human respondents under pressure, Velthan said, and his voice was edging towards something that was doing the work of certainty without the actual material to support it. This overreach, this determination to find fault where established science has already settled the matter. I have not raised my voice once, I said. I have not moved from this table. I have presented primary source documentation. For each of 7 counts, everything I have cited is in the Academy's own archive, accessible to anyone who looks. If that constitutes selective reasoning, I would genuinely like to understand what you would describe as rigorous method. A sound moved through the gallery, not words, just a sound. Vashko raised one hand. The room went quiet. Instructor Velthan, she said, do you dispute the authenticity of the correspondence document the petitioner has submitted? A pause. The correspondence exists, he said. The context surrounding it is considerably more complex than has been represented here. Do you dispute that the document is accurately reproduced from the archive? Vashko said. A shorter pause. No, he said. Vashko looked at her counsel. Colleagues, something passed between them quickly and silently. The council will take a brief recess, she said. They left through the side door. I sat down. I placed my hands flat on the table and looked at them. 4 minutes and 17 seconds. I counted everyone. When the council returned and Vashko took her seat, the chamber had the quality of a held breath. She looked at me first, then at Velthan. The council has reviewed the petitioner's submissions on all 7 counts, she said. The council finds sufficient documentary evidence consisting of primary source materials and peer-reviewed citation to uphold all 7 disputed claims as submitted. Effective immediately, Senior Instructor Velthorn's primary curriculum modules are suspended pending independent academic review by an external panel to be appointed from off-station institutions. The correspondence documents submitted by the petitioner will be entered into the formal session record. The paper titled Cognitive Ceiling, Assessment in Deathworld Origin Species will be flagged in the Academy citation system pending review of its methodology and data conditions. She paused. The council commends the petitioner for the thoroughness and precision of her submission. She looked directly at me. The quality of documentation and argumentation presented today is, by any measure, a rigorous piece of academic work. The chamber did not erupt. There was no cheer, no sudden noise, but there was a sound, a long collective exhalation from nearly 300 beings who had all been holding something in for slightly different reasons. And inside that sound was something I had not fully anticipated feeling. It was not triumph. Triumph would have been lighter. This was heavier and more true. It was the feeling that comes from doing something that needed to be done and doing it correctly when doing it. Correctly was the only thing that had ever actually mattered about doing it. I gathered my documents, I stood up, I walked out of the grand chamber through the lower entry into the violet-lit corridor. The orange light from the gas giant lay across the corridor floor in long shapes, the same ones it had always made. I stood in that light for a moment. My hands were steady. My breathing was exactly normal. I leaned against the corridor wall and let myself be still. Just still. The morning after the hearing, no one knew how to talk to me. That was fine. I did not need them to. The academy felt different the way spaces feel when something that was background noise for everyone is suddenly gone, not silent, just shifted. The air in the common corridors had a different quality to it, or perhaps I was only reading the people moving through it differently. Velthan's name was in every cluster of conversation I passed, used in the clipped, careful way that people use a name when they are still figuring out how to frame what happened around it. Preth passed me before the first morning session. He stopped, which he had not done before, in a corridor, and looked at me with an expression that had moved past whatever category he had previously assigned me to. "You cost me 400 credits, he said. "I am sorry about that," I said. "No," he said, "you are not." "No," I said, "I am not." He almost smiled. It was in his eyes. More than anywhere else, a small, quick thing that I thought he probably did not show people very often. Then he walked on. I thought about what that cost him. The tiny revision it required of a framework he had probably never had a good reason to examine before. I filed it as a useful piece of information about him. Not everyone, when forced to update their view, updates it cleanly. Preth appeared to be someone who could. That was a thing worth knowing. Velthan's classes were reassigned to a substitute named Pilvas, a younger Orathi who spent the first session visibly unsure where to position herself in the room, whether to stand where Velthan had always stood, whether to use the same projection panel, whether any of the room's arrangements carried weight she should not disturb. She assigned independent reading and left us to work, which I thought was a reasonable approach given the circumstances. I used the time to look at count 8 of my as yet unfiled next round. The research for it was not complete. I would not file it until it was. Velthan himself appeared once in the faculty corridor 2 days after the hearing. We were walking from opposite directions in a corridor too narrow to comfortably avoid. He looked at me. I looked at him. Neither of us said anything. We walked past each other. That was the entirety of it. He was reassigned to a non-teaching research position within 2 weeks. The formal announcement described it as a mutual agreement for a period of independent study, which is the kind of language institutions use when they want the record to show cooperation rather than consequence. I read the announcement once and did not write anything down. There was nothing there worth preserving. The harder thing in those weeks was not the logistics. The logistics were manageable. The external review panel was being assembled. The curriculum suspension was in place. The citation flag had gone through the network too. Every database that referenced the cognitive ceiling assessment paper. The process was moving. That was what processes did when they had been properly started. The harder thing was internal and harder to name. I had expected relief after the hearing. I had felt it briefly the first night, a clean, light feeling of completion, but underneath it and lasting considerably longer was a heaviness I had not prepared for, not sadness, more like the feeling that comes when you have walked a very long distance to correct a mistake that should never have existed, and you are glad you walked it, and you are still tired. 11 human beings had sat in a testing room with their oxygen dropping and had been assessed, and their results had been published and cited, and used to construct an institutional reality that had shaped every human student across 15 academic institutions for 30 years. And the reason all of that had happened was not complexity. It was not a difficult ethical situation where reasonable people had weighed competing considerations and made a defensible call. Vel then had received a message from Ron saying the conditions were wrong, and he had replied in 2 sentences that the timeline mattered more. That was the whole of it. And for 30 years, 240 researchers had cited that paper. None of them had pulled the raw data request. None of them had read the ethics submission. None of them had noticed or looked for a sample size of 11, perhaps. They had trusted the name on the paper. Perhaps they had been busy, as researchers always are, perhaps, and this was the thing I kept returning to, the thing that felt the most important and the hardest to say plainly. The conclusion confirmed something they were already comfortable believing, and comfortable conclusions do not invite the same scrutiny as uncomfortable ones. They do not get checked with the same care because the person checking does not expect to find anything wrong, and expectations shape what you see. That was not unique to the galactic academic community. It was not an alien phenomenon. It was something I had read about in Earth's own scientific history again and again. The way a field could move in one direction for decades because the dominant figures in it believed something, and everyone who built their career in that field built around that belief, and challenging it felt like challenging the foundation rather than just one room in the house. What was unique to this situation was that the subject of the flawed research was my species, and I was sitting in the back row. I thought about that for a long time. In the days after the hearing, I thought about it while I worked on my next filing in the early morning hours before the main systems powered up. I thought about it during Peel Vash's classes, sitting in my unchanged tier 5 seat in the unchanged back row. The tier reassessment had been initiated, but the process had its own timeline. I was still where I had always been, placed in the short term, even though the evidence used to place me there had just been upheld as empirically inaccurate on 7 documented counts. That was a strange thing to sit inside, but it was also clarifying because it meant the work was not done. A ruling was a beginning, not an end. The paper was flagged, the curriculum suspended, the external panel assembling, and I was still in the back row, and 15 institutions had not yet begun their own reviews, and the 6 errors in my notes that I had not filed yet were still sitting in my notebook, waiting for the moment I could prove each one a third way to my satisfaction. There was no version of this where I was finished. There was only the version where I kept going. The message from council member HFY arrived 12 days after the hearing. It was formal in tone, brief, and requested a meeting at my convenience for what she described as a research consultation. I replied the same day, We met 3 days later. The consultation room was small, off the administrative corridor, with a round table and 2 chairs and a viewport at an angle of the gas giant I had not seen before. From here I could see a large atmospheric storm system moving in slow spirals across the planet's upper hemisphere, the kind of storm that from this distance looked almost decorative, though I had read enough about gas giant atmospheric dynamics to know what kind of forces were actually at work inside it. Andriel arrived with the careful, deliberate movement of someone who had evolved in a social environment. Rapid or sudden motion was read as aggressive. She was tall, and when she sat across from me and placed her hands flat on the table, she had the quality of someone who listened with their whole body. I read your submission in full before the hearing, she said, and again after. Thank you, I said. I want to ask you something directly, she said, and I want an honest answer, even if the honest answer is complicated. All right, I said. In 31 years of council proceedings and faculty disputes, I have not seen a petitioner maintain that level of composure under that degree of sustained opposition, she said. Not with 3 senior faculty colleagues at the respondents' table. Not with an audience of nearly 300 observers. How did you do it? I thought about the question. She was not asking it to flatter me. She was asking because she genuinely wanted to understand something, and understanding it mattered to her in a way that went beyond courtesy. Can I tell you about Earth first? I said. Please, she said. She went completely still in the way that she had, the way that meant she was fully present. I told her about Earth the way I had not told anyone at the academy, not the catalog of dangers version that alien students generally expected and found entertaining, the list of predators and pathogens and extreme weather events that played well as a kind of exotic spectacle. The real version. I told her about the oceans, which covered most of the planet's surface, and which were so layered with pressure differentials and temperature zones and chemical gradients that they constituted an entirely separate world from the land, and we had gone into them anyway, generation after generation, and studied them and charted them, and eventually built things that could go all the way to the deepest trench. I told her about the mountains where the air thinned so sharply that it could kill you in under an hour if you stopped moving, and which human beings had been climbing for the better part of recorded history. I told her about disease, about the centuries before we understood what was making us sick, when things invisible to the eye were the primary cause of death for our species, and how we had found our way through it, not quickly, not without enormous cost, but through the slow accumulation of observation and correction and the application of what we learned to the next problem. The thing Earth teaches, I said, is not that the world is manageable. It is not that things will work out. Earth does not promise either of those things. What it teaches, what living on a death world produces over a long enough time, is that you do not have to feel steady to act steadily. And GT snorts. And GT, fear is not a stop signal, it is information. It tells you something real is in front of you. What you do with that information is the question, and the answer Earth has built into me is you keep working, you do what needs doing while the fear runs alongside you. You do not wait for it to stop, you simply do not give it the front position. HFY was quiet after I finished. Her hands were still on the table. The storm system on the gas giant moved in its slow, enormous arc outside the viewport. I cited the cognitive ceiling assessment paper in 2 of my own published works. She said, I know, I said, when I read your submission the night before the hearing and understood what you had found about the sample conditions, she said, I spent 2 hours sitting with the fact that I had cited a paper built on 11 oxygen-compromised subjects without ever checking the data conditions. I did not sleep well that night. I understand that, I said. I tell you this not as a confession, she said, but because I want you to understand that the problem you addressed is not contained to Velthon. His paper traveled as far as it did because it arrived at a conclusion that a great many researchers in this field were already comfortable with. That is not an excuse. It is a description of a broader condition that the external review panel will need to engage with directly. I have 6 more, I said. She looked at me. 6 more disputed claims in the standard xenobiology canon, I said, not Thon's papers this time, other researchers, other institutions. Same pattern in each case. Conclusions that confirmed existing assumptions, built on methodology that does not survive scrutiny when someone actually applies it to the primary sources. HFY was very still. You have not filed them, she said. 4 are ready, I said. The remaining 2 still need another round of verification. I will not file anything I cannot prove 3 ways. When will you file the 4 that are ready, she said. After the external review panel has finished its preliminary work, I said. I want the field to have engaged with Velthon's record before I add to the load, partially so that the panel has the context to see the pattern, partially because I do not want any of the next filings to be dismissed as an extension of this one's momentum, rather than evaluated on their own evidence. HFY looked at me for a long time. The expression on her face was one I had no name for in any language I knew well enough to use with confidence. The external review panel will want student testimony, she said. Specifically, testimony about the experience of placement and instruction under the current tier system as a death world origin student. Yes, I said, I will testify. Good, she said. She paused. The tier reassessment for your enrollment has been initiated. I filed that request the morning after the hearing. Thank you, I said. The tier system itself has been under discussion for several cycles, she said. That conversation has moved. Slowly, it may move faster now, she held my gaze steadily. You made a considerable amount of noise, Mara Elliott, for someone who never once raised her voice. I walked back to the dormitory through the violet-lit corridors with that sentence sitting in me. A considerable amount of noise. I thought about Velthon calling what Earth had built in me form of damage. I thought about Sealron asking the right question and being told no in 2 sentences and then staying quiet for 30 years. I thought about all the human students across 15 institutions who were sitting in their back rows right now today while the review panel was being assembled and the tier system conversation was moving faster. The institutional fallout from the hearing moved in waves, each one slightly further from the origin than the last. The first wave was the immediate. Administrative response, curriculum. Suspended citation flagged, panel. Assembled, I had been present for all of that and could track it directly. The second wave was the correspondence. From Dr. Marsh at the Callaway Institute, from the Institute of Galactic Comparative Biology, from the 3 independent monitors who had attended the hearing and who filed their own observer reports to the consortium's academic oversight body. I read each of those documents as they became available in the announcements archive. They were careful, formal, and cumulatively significant in a way that any single one of them would not have been alone. The third wave was the one I had not fully anticipated. The students, not just Owen, though Owen was part of it, other students from other species who had been sitting in their own back rows for their own reasons and who had watched what happened in the grand chamber and had started asking questions they had not been asking before. Some of them came to find me. Some of them went directly to Kieran, who had apparently become, in the weeks after the hearing, a kind of informal resource for students trying to understand how the formal dispute process worked. She did not tell me this directly. I found out when I saw, on 3 separate occasions, a different student sitting across from her in the common study room, while she patiently explained citation standards and filing procedures, her antennae in the calm, upright position. That meant she was in her element. I asked her about it one evening when we were both back in the dormitory. "You have been teaching the filing process," I said. "I have been answering questions," she said, in the precise way she had of distinguishing between things that looked similar but were not. "How many students?" I said. "She thought 7 this week," she said. 12 last week. I expect it will decrease as the process becomes more generally understood." I looked at her. "Kiernan," I said, "you are extraordinary." She appeared to find this embarrassing, which was a Velhari trait I had come to find genuinely endearing. They were a species that took immense pride in their work and found direct praise of that work almost impossible to accept gracefully. Her antennae did a rapid back and forth movement. "I'm answering questions," she said. "Again, you are the one who made the questions worth asking." That was, I thought, the most accurate description of what had happened that I had encountered. The hearing had not changed the questions. Those questions had always existed. What it had changed was whether asking them seemed possible. And possible is the threshold that matters. Below it, questions stay in notebooks. Above it, they become filings. The Urathi student from my 3rd class session, the one who had walked out of Velthon's lecture last cycle and been given a disciplinary notation, came to find me in the library during the 3rd week after the hearing. I had heard about her from Kiernan, but had not met her directly. Her name was a series of Urathi consonants that my vocal apparatus struggled with, so she had given me a galactic standard approximation, Re. She had been working on a methodology concern in a botany paper for most of the past cycle, she said, but had not known how to frame it formally. We sat together for 2 hours. I looked at what she had. It was real, a genuine methodological issue with a claimed sample size that did not match the raw data documentation she had found in the Institute's archive. It was not as significant as the Velthon 7th count, but it did not need to be. It needed to be documented correctly and filed correctly, and presented to whoever heard it with the same level of care that had gone into every filing I had been part of. That was the standard, and it did not change based on the size of the error. "Is it worth filing?" she asked. She meant, is this error significant enough to justify the process? Every error that gets documented correctly is worth filing, I said. Size of the error determines the size of the correction. The correctness of the documentation determines whether the correction happens at all. She looked at me for a moment. Then she looked at her notes with an expression that I recognized. The shift that happens when someone has been carrying something uncertain for a long time and has just received a framework that makes it possible to act. "All right," she said, "I will verify it 3 ways." "Good," I said. The Davari first cycle student whose name was Annan brought me something different, not a potential filing but a question. She had found a paper she was trying to read for her coursework, and the methodology section used terminology she did not fully understand. She wanted to know what the terms meant and whether the methodology was sound. I read the section. The terminology was standard. The methodology was in the specific area she was asking about, not sound. There was a gap between what the instruments used could actually measure and what the paper claimed they had measured, but this was not a situation for a filing. This was a situation for a conversation with her course instructor, with the specific question she now had the vocabulary to ask. I told her that. I told her what to ask. She thanked me and left, and I sat in the library for a moment after she was gone and thought about what that interaction had been. It had been teaching, not formal teaching. I was a first cycle student, not a faculty member, and I had no standing to instruct anyone, but the transmission of enough understanding for one person to formulate a better question than they had before. That was a form of it, and it seemed increasingly to be what the hours after the hearing had become for me, alongside the continuing work of verification and filing. I was not sure how I felt about that. I had not come to the academy to become anyone's resource. I had come to learn and to do the work and to fix what needed fixing through the formal channels that existed for exactly that purpose, but fixing things formally and teaching people how to notice what was wrong were not. I was beginning to understand separable activities. The filings changed what was in the record. The conversations changed what people looked for. Both were necessary. The record without the looking is a closed book. The looking without the record is a conversation that leaves no trace. I needed to be doing both. That realization settled into me quietly, the way realizations usually arrive when you are not specifically looking for them. I added it to the list of things that would shape what the next year looked like, alongside the 2 verification rounds still needed for counts 8 and 9, and the pending testimony for the external panel, and the reassessment process that was ongoing but not complete. Faster was not fast enough, but faster was something, and something was always the thing you worked with until you could make it more. 3 months after the hearing, an Orthy academic journal called the Proceedings of the Unified Sciences Review published a correspondence piece by Dr. Lynn Alkifer of the Callaway Institute. It documented 3 previously unchallenged errors in the standard xenobiological reference Materials on human cardiovascular adaptation. The piece was 4 pages long. In the final footnote, it cited my hearing before the Council of Seven as a precedent-establishing event in student-level academic dispute in the field of death world xenobiology. My name was in a footnote of the Proceedings of the Unified Sciences Review. I showed it to Kieran at breakfast. She made a sound I had never heard from her before, a short, rapid vibration she later told me was the Velhari equivalent of involuntary, uncontrollable delight. "You are in a footnote," she said. "A footnote," I said. "Yes. That is how it starts," she said. I thought about that for the rest of the morning. A footnote. Easy to miss if you were not looking, but there if you looked, permanently part of the record, which was the only thing that ultimately mattered about small things, that they were there, documented, real, and that someone who came after you and needed them would be able to find them. The external review panel had been working for 6 weeks by then. 3 researchers from institutions outside the consortium, a Divari biologist from the Western Academic Network, a Urathi physiologist whose own work Velthon had dismissed in a published paper 8 years ago, and a human researcher named Dr. Colin Marsh from the Callaway Institute, who had been studying interspecies cognitive comparison methodology for 20 years, and who I suspected had accepted the appointment with some degree of personal investment in the outcome. I had not met any of them yet, but I had read all 3 of their published work, and I thought the panel composition was a careful and deliberate choice. I gave my testimony to the panel on a Wednesday afternoon in a conference room off the main administrative corridor. It was a small room, just the 3 panel members, a recording system, and me. No gallery, no respondent, just questions and answers, which was, in its own way, more demanding than the hearing had been, because in the hearing I had been the one controlling the structure. In testimony, you answer what you are asked, and you trust that the questions are aimed at the truth. They were. The Divari biologist asked about the tier placement experience in practical terms, what it meant for access to resources, to study spaces, to faculty attention, to the informal networks of academic contact that in any institution tend to determine as much of a student's trajectory as the formal curriculum. I answered all of it honestly, including the parts that were uncomfortable to say directly, that the back row was not merely a seat position, it was a signal, and signals shape behavior in both directions. The student begins to believe the signal, the faculty begins to respond to the signal. The outcome becomes, in a self-reinforcing way, what the signal predicted, not because the student was less capable, but because the environment built around the signal treated them as if they were, and environments shape people. The year after, the physiologist asked about the stress response demonstration. I described it in detail. I described what Velthon had said after it, the word he had used, damage. The physiologist wrote something and did not look up for a moment after I said it. Dr. Marsh asked about the filing process, how I had found the raw data, what had led me to look at the ethics submission, whether I had expected to find what I found. No, I said, I expected to find methodology problems. I found those in most of the papers by the 3rd or 4th reading. The raw data was a later step. I pulled it because I had learned that in cases where the methodology Looked clean, the problem was often upstream before the paper, not in it. Where did you learn that? He said. I thought about it. From Earth. Mostly, I said. On Earth you learn early that the thing that is trying to hurt you is not always visible from where you are standing. You look uphill. You look at what is above you and whether it is stable. You do not assume that what you can see is the whole of what is present. He wrote that down too. After the testimony session, Dr. Marsh walked out with me into the corridor. He was a quiet man, compact with the kind of stillness that comes from decades of working in rooms where patience is a professional requirement. I have been doing this research for 20 years, he said. I have been waiting for someone to pull the Velthin data conditions for most of that time. Did you know? I said. I suspected, he said, the sample size was always too small for the claims being made, but suspicion is not a filing. You need the documents. He paused. You had the documents. I had access to the archive, I said. So did everyone else. Yes, he said, they did. He left it there. I understood what he was not saying. Access and looking are different things. And looking requires believing that what you will find is worth the cost of finding it. I went back to my dormitory and sat at my desk for a while before opening my notes. I looked at the viewport. The gas giant was in a different position relative to the station than it had been when I arrived, because the station's orbit had moved it and the gas giant's own rotation had continued, and things that seem fixed are usually only fixed relative to a particular position at a particular moment. Change the position, and they are moving all the time. I opened my notes to the 4 counts of the next filing. They were ready. I had been waiting for the right moment to submit them, and I thought the right moment was now, after my testimony to the panel, after the correspondence piece in the proceedings, when the field was already in the process of looking at itself, and what another filing would do was give it more to look at rather than interrupt something that needed space. I submitted the second dispute filing on a Thursday morning. It named no single instructor. It cited 4 separate papers by 4 separate researchers at 3 different institutions, all following the same pattern I had documented in Velthin's work. Claims that exceeded what the cited evidence supported, methodology that had not been adequately scrutinized before publication, and a 30-year accumulation of secondary citations that had given the original claims an authority they had not earned. The response from the Academy's administrative system was notably faster than it had been for the first filing. No anomalous flag, no automated procedural query. The processing confirmation arrived within 4 hours. The formal review date was set within the week. Word of the second filing moved through the Academy differently than the first one had. The first filing had been treated at the outset as an oddity, a first cycle student doing something no student had done in 30 cycles against an instructor whose position seemed to make the challenge improbable. By the time people understood what they were watching, it was already the hearing. The second filing had no element of surprise. People knew what it was before the administrative confirmation had even finished processing. 3 separate students found me in the first 2 days after the filing to ask questions. One was a year at the student from the 3rd cycle who had been studying the same field and had 2 papers she wanted to show me. One was a Divari first cycle student who had noticed something in a physiology reference text and had not known what to do with the noticing. One was a human student, second cycle, a young man named Owen who had been at the academy for a full year and had, he told me, been trying very hard not to think about the back row. I sat with each of them separately. I looked at what they brought. In two of the three cases, what they had was not quite ready. The evidence was there but needed more verification, more cross-referencing, more tracing back to the primary source before it was filing ready. I told them exactly what was needed and why, and I gave them the same standard I had held myself to. 3 different ways, primary sources where possible, secondary citation only from peer-reviewed journals, no speculation, nothing included unless it could be proven and proven again. Owen sat across from me in the study room on a Tuesday morning with his notebook open and looked at me for a moment before he asked his question. "Were you afraid?" he said before the hearing. "Yes," I said. "How did you go in anyway?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without making it sound larger than it was. "On Earth," I said, "things that can end you do not wait for you to feel ready. You learn to do the necessary thing while the fear is still running, not instead of the fear. Alongside it," I paused. "Also, I was very angry. That helped." He laughed. It was the first time I had heard him laugh, and it was a good sound, the sound of someone whose tension has just released slightly in a direction that felt safe. "I have been angry for a year," he said. "Good," I said. "Use it, but use it precisely." Kieran had been following the second filing's progress with the focused attention she brought to anything she decided mattered, which was considerable. She was a meticulous person. Her translation work was extraordinary. Her memory for procedural detail was better than mine, and she had quietly become the most reliable verifier of my sourcing. She caught 2 citation formatting errors in the second filing before I submitted it, both of which would have been technically minor, but which would have given the administrative system an excuse for a processing delay. "You are very good at this," I told her one morning. "I'm good at checking things," she said. "You are good at finding things worth checking." "We make a reasonable team," I said. "We make an excellent team," she said. "You should say what you mean." I thought about that. "We make an excellent team," I said. Her antennae rose. The weeks after the second hearing had a different texture than the weeks after the first time. Everything had felt raw and new, the ruling still settling, the administration still adjusting, the students still figuring out how to incorporate what had happened into their existing frameworks for how the academy worked. The second time, it felt less like a disruption and more like a continuation. The process had been established. People understood it now. They knew what a filing looked like, what a hearing looked like, what the council's role in it was, what the standards were. The unknown had become known, and known things are manageable in a way that unknown things are not. Owen submitted his filing 6 weeks after our conversation in the study room. It was a single count dispute against a paper in the second-year curriculum that had applied data from non-human subjects to claims about human physiology without disclosure. The documentation was careful and complete. I had reviewed it once at his request and suggested 2 minor additions to the source citation. Format that was all it needed. He had done the work. His hearing was shorter than mine. One count clearly documented primary. Source evidence presented without editorializing. The counsel upheld it in the same session without a recess. Afterward, he came to find me in the library. That was not as frightening as I expected, he said. It gets less frightening the more prepared you are, I said. You were very prepared. I had a good example, he said. I looked at him. You had a good standard, I said. You met it yourself. Those are different things. He thought about that, then he sat down at the adjacent terminal and opened his notes. He had 4 more potential counts he was working through. I had 2 still. In verification, we worked in the same room in the same comfortable silence that I had learned was one of the most productive states available to a person, present, focused, and not needing anything from the moment except the work itself. The second panel hearing was different from the first in almost every respect. It was quieter, fewer observers, smaller chamber, a more technical atmosphere. The 4 disputed papers were from smaller, less prominent researchers than Velthon, and the claims were narrower, the corrections more specific. There was no single dramatic moment equivalent to Ceilron's correspondence. There was only the slow, methodical work of demonstrating 4 separate times that someone had published a claim they could not fully support, and that the claim had been used, and that the use had consequences. All 4 counts were upheld. Afterward, Vashkiel found me in the corridor outside the hearing room. She was alone without the full formality of the council session around her, and she looked, for the first time I had seen, like someone who was tired, in a way that was personal rather than professional. The tier reassessment for your enrollment has concluded, she said. The result will be formally communicated to you this afternoon. I wanted to tell you myself before the official notice. Thank you, I said. You are being placed in Tier 2, she said. I looked at her. Not Tier 1, I said. The assessment committee felt that Tier 2 was the appropriate placement given your current cycle standing, she said. Tier 1 is typically reserved for students in their 3rd or 4th cycle, regardless of performance. I thought about that for a moment. Tier 2, 1 row back from the front, several rows forward from the back. All right, I said. I thought you might object, Vasquez said. The tier system is still under review, I said. If the review reaches the conclusion I expect it to, my tier assignment will become irrelevant within the next academic cycle regardless. Vasquez looked at me with an expression I had seen on her face before, the one that I thought might be something between respect and a particular kind of weariness that comes from being the person responsible for a system you are watching become different than it has been. Yes, she said, I expect that is true. Is the review moving? I said. It is moving, she said, faster than it was. I nodded. Faster, still not fast enough, but real. 6 weeks after the second hearing, a student at an affiliated institution in the outer consortium, a year at the 4th cycle student, named one of the council's confirmed pronunciation equivalent for reinvest, filed a formal academic dispute at her own institution, citing methodology concerns with 3 papers in the planetary biology curriculum. She cited my first filing in her own Documentation as established precedent. For student-level dispute procedure. Her filing was the first of its kind at that institution in over 40 cycles. Kieran sent me the transcript of the announcement when it came through the Interinstitution Academic Network. Her message with it was 3 words, "You made noise." I wrote back, "So did she." Because that was the thing that mattered. Not that I had done it. That someone else had done it next, somewhere else. With their own documentation and their own evidence and their own version of the anger that needed to be used. Precisely. That the thing I had done had made it slightly easier for the next person to believe it was possible to do. That was not the same as the problem being solved. The problem was very far from solved. There were 6 disputed claims still in my notes, 4 now filed and upheld, 2 still being verified. There were 15 institutions still operating tier replacement systems built partly on the foundation of Velthan's flagged paper. The external review panel's full report had not yet been published. The tier system review at the IAUS was ongoing, and its outcome was not guaranteed. There were more errors in the canon. I was fairly certain of that, and I was fairly certain I had not found all of them yet. There was a great deal of work still ahead. That was all right. I had time. I was 17 years old in my first cycle of study at an institution that, when I had arrived, had not known what to do with me except seat me in the back row and hope I stayed quiet. I was not staying quiet. I was not planning to. On a Friday morning, 4 months after the first hearing, I sat down in my new assigned seat, tier 2, second row from the front on the left side. Peel Vass was still the substitute for the curriculum module that had been Thon's. She was getting better at it. She had stopped being unsure of where to stand. She made eye contact with the whole room when she talked, including the back. I opened my notebook to a fresh page. I wrote the date, then I wrote counts 8 and 9, preliminary verification. Round 2. Kieran was sitting 2 seats to my right, in a tier 2 seat she had earned through entirely ordinary means. Her translation work had been formally recognized by the linguistics faculty in the previous cycle, and the resulting tier reassessment had happened without drama or documentation or dispute. Hearings, just work recognized the way it was supposed to work. She glanced over and saw what I was writing. "Already," she said. "The preliminary verification will take at least another 3 weeks for count 9, I said. "I want to start early. You have been in this seat for less than 1 class period," she said. "I know," I said. "You moved from tier 5 to tier 2, and you have already started on the next filing," she said. "The tier was never the point," I said. "The point was always the work." She looked at me for a moment. Her antennae rose to the position I had learned to recognize as something between fondness and exasperation, and the kind of respect that comes from watching someone do a thing consistently over a long period of time. "You are exhausting," she said. "Yes," I said, "I know." Peel Vask called the class to order. I put my notes for counts 8 and 9 in the back of my notebook, open to the front, and paid attention to the lecture because the lecture was also where the work happened, and I was not in this room only to file disputes. I was in this room to learn. Those 2 things were not in competition. They were the same thing approached from different angles. The thing about Earth, the thing that Velthun had gotten most wrong. Underneath all 14 papers and all 240 citations and all the carefully colored diagrams with human capacity rendered flat gray was not the fear response or the cognitive architecture or any of the specific measurable things he had built. His case from the thing he had gotten most wrong was simpler and larger than any of that. He had looked at what we had survived. The storms, the gravity, the billion accumulated pressures of a planet that treated survival as a test you had to pass every single generation without exception. And he had concluded that those things had made us lesser than we would otherwise have been. He had seen the evidence of everything we had come through and decided it was evidence of limitation. He had never considered that it might be evidence of something else. He had never asked what you become over a long enough time on a world that does not offer the option of stopping, when every generation has to be strong enough to hand something forward to the next one, or the next one does not arrive, when fear is not a thing that ends you, but a thing you have learned over millions of years of practice to carry while you keep moving. We are not special because of what Earth is. We are not faster or stronger or more perceptive than other species in ways that show up cleanly in a laboratory assessment. What we are is something that does not stop, not because of some unique architecture in our neurons, but because a planet spent a very long time teaching us, one generation at a time, through the only curriculum that cannot be falsified by a flawed study or a biased researcher. The real consequences of what happens when you stop. Velthun had looked at that and seen defect. He had seen reactive cognition and emotional dysregulation and absence of appropriate threat response. He had seen 11 people sitting in a room with inadequate oxygen performing below their capacity and decided that was what we were at our best. He had been wrong, not in an interesting, complicated, defensible way, not in the way that thoughtful people are wrong when they have considered something carefully and reached an incorrect conclusion in good faith. He had been wrong in the way that people are wrong when they decide the conclusion first and look for data to confirm it afterward, and when someone on their own team sends them a message saying the conditions are not right, they send back 2 sentences saying to carry on because the timeline matters more than the truth. That kind of wrong does not fix itself. It has to be fixed. Someone has to go look at the original data request and the ethics submission and the correspondence file that has been sitting in the Open Records Archive for 20 years and pull it out and stand up in a formal hearing and say, here is what was done and here is the evidence and here is why it matters. I had done that, and then Reinvest had done it at her institution, and Owen was working on his documentation, and the 2-year HFY students from the second day had gone back to their papers, and Dr. Marsh had gone back to the Callaway Institute with 20 years of accumulated suspicion that now had primary source documentation to support it, and the Proceedings of the Unified Sciences Review had published Dr. O'Keefe's correspondence piece with my name in the footnote. None of that was everything. It was not close to everything. The tier system review was still ongoing. The external panel's full report was still weeks away. There were errors I had not found yet in papers I had not yet read, in fields I had not yet reached. But the direction was clear, And the direction, once it is clear and once more than one person has started moving in it, is the hardest thing in the world to reverse. I turned to a new page in my notebook. Peel Vass was explaining a concept, adaptive physiology, that I had already covered in my own reading, but I listened carefully anyway, because sometimes the second time you encounter an idea in a different voice, you understand a part of it that you had glossed over the first time. The gas giant turned outside the viewport at the end of the room. The same slow, enormous arc it had been making since long before any of us arrived, and would continue making long after we left, indifferent and patient and vast. I wrote a note in the margin, something small and specific about Count 8. Connection I had just made between two sources I had been treating as separate. I circled it. That was the way it usually happened, not in the dramatic moments, not in the hearings, but in a classroom on an ordinary Friday morning, when you were doing the ordinary work, and a connection appeared that had not been visible the day before. I would check it tonight. I would verify it 3 ways before I let it become anything more than a circled note in a margin. That was the process. Patient and careful and completely stubborn. Earth had given me all of those things. I intended to use every one of them.